Brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, 'I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father.'" Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him, and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intend to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way, he reassured them, speaking kindly to them.
Thank you, Cindy. I wonder what they were expecting him to say. What Joseph's brothers were expecting him to say when he stood up to speak to them. Because 20 years earlier, they had decided to kill him and throw him into a pit. Kill him and throw him into a pit out of their incredible rage and enormous jealousy over Joseph's favored son's status with their father Jacob. Symbolized, of course, by that famous coat of many colors, as it's so usually referred to. A garment that Jacob had given Joseph. A garment that in children's Bibles looks so magical, but in truth was an enormously expensive and valuable gift that Jacob gave Joseph to the exclusion of all of his older brothers. They were going to kill him and throw him into a pit until the second oldest brother, Reuben, convinces them to at least not murder Joseph. Before we try to hang some hero's medal around Reuben's neck, though, he does agree with the other brothers to instead sell Joseph. They sell him to merchants traveling by who take Joseph with them to Egypt, where he becomes a slave. But as we know, that is far from the end of Joseph's story. Joseph not only survives in Egypt, but 20 years later, he is thriving through talent and skill and perseverance, and although not explicitly mentioned for us until the very end of this saga in the passage that Cindy just shared with us, implicitly all along the way, the invisible hand of God. 20 years later, Joseph is basically the prime minister of Egypt. And he is a good one. Because when a long, severe famine strikes not just Egypt, but all of the surrounding lands, Joseph has Egypt ready. He has stored up not just enough grain to easily meet the needs of the Egyptian people for as long as the famine lasts. There's also enough in reserve for him to sell grain to other peoples and lands in need. People like, for instance, his brothers and their father Jacob. Jacob sends Joseph's brothers to Egypt to buy grain in the midst of that famine. And it will be the first time in 20 years that they will come face to face. And it will be the beginning of a series of events that will lead to their reconciliation. But not just yet. That full reconciliation comes again in the passage that we just shared, but it takes a while to get there. By the time we reach this point, Joseph and his brothers are at least partly reconciled. He has invited them and their families and their father Jacob to move nearby so that he can take care of them throughout the rest of the famine. But there is no indication given that Joseph is ready to set aside the harm that they have done to him. And so when Jacob dies, the brothers are afraid. They are afraid that the only thing that had been standing between them and Joseph taking vengeance for what they did to him was Jacob. That Joseph had only refrained from taking vengeance for the sake of their father, but now with their father gone, And so the brothers approach Joseph in his royal workspace, his royal quarters. And they tell him that on his deathbed, Jacob asked that Joseph forgive the brothers of the harm that they had done to him. But that word forgives that we see in the Hebrew Genesis is written in has multiple meanings. It also includes the idea of refraining from seeking vengeance and showing mercy. Thing is, the writer doesn't tell us whether Jacob did or did not make that request. But it doesn't seem to matter to Joseph. I wonder what his brothers were expecting to hear when he stood up to speak to them. And I wonder how surprised, maybe even shocked they were when what he says is, "Am I in the place of God? Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to do me harm, but God intended it for good. Am I in the place of God?" The meaning of that rhetorical question that Joseph asks is the same meaning as when the writer of the book of Deuteronomy and Paul says to the early Christian community in Rome, "Vengeance belongs to God." Vengeance belongs to God, Joseph says to his brothers. You intended to do me harm, but God intended it for good. While that phrase, though, can, I'm afraid, sort of too easily lead to the belief that God intentionally allows harm or inflicts harm for the purpose of later bringing about some greater good, I I find that to be a rather problematic theological perspective. So I think maybe the renowned biblical scholar and translator Everett Fox puts it in a better way. He has that phrase saying, "You planned for evil, but God planned over it." But God planned over it. In other words, your evil did not get the last word. God and God's ways got the last word. And one of those ways, one of those words, is mercy. The mercy that Joseph offers his brothers. It's one of the reasons, one of the major reasons, why Joseph is often considered one of the Bible's greatest moral and ethical heroes. But before we go trying to put that hero's medal around Joseph's neck too, we might consider, as the prolific rabbi and writer Joseph Telushkin says, we might consider the fact that before Joseph gets to that offer of mercy, there are several steps all along the way before where he is, as Telushkin describes it, cold, calculating, manipulative, and even cruel towards his brothers. And when we look at the entire saga, I think Telushkin has a point. Or maybe I'm just biased. Maybe I'm just inclined to see it that way because I have seen this mercy thing done and done better. Done by someone who is a living, breathing, real-life hero to me. I wonder what he was expecting her to say when she got up to speak that day. When she, my sister-in-law, Barbara Boyer, got up to speak in court on the day when the verdict and sentencing were going to be determined for the man responsible for the death of her 20-year-old son, Aaron, in a fiery car crash in northern New York. "20 years ago, this past Thursday, Barb's son, Aaron, my brother Brian's son, Aaron, my nephew and godson, Aaron, lost his life in that car crash. Aaron was a likable, often goofy, and deeply kind-hearted young man. But he was also impulsive and enough of a people pleaser that he was easily manipulated at times by those who didn't necessarily have his best interests in mind. Traits that led at that particular time in his life to him not always making the best of decisions. Like, for instance, the decision on that day, July 20th, 2003, to get into a car at the end of a day-long adult men's softball tournament with an older guy from where I'm also from, who had been drinking and who was known for having a reckless streak. Taking one of the many turns along one of the many winding roads in northern New York at a highly excessive speed, the driver crashed that car into a rock wall. Aaron did not survive. The driver did, but he would be permanently paralyzed from the waist down. I wonder what he was expecting my sister-in-law Barb to say when she got up that day in court to speak. He was facing not just life in a wheelchair, but the possibility of prison time, charged with vehicular homicide. I wonder what he was expecting her to say. And I wonder how surprised he was at it. Because when Barb got up to speak, yes, she calmly and clearly stated the long-lasting effect that this had had on her family and would continue to have. The effect that it would have on her two teenage daughters. The effect that it had already had on her husband, my brother. I wonder what he would have said in court that day if he had been the one to speak. But see, he never got the chance. My brother's heart, already severely weakened from a serious coronary years earlier, had succumbed to a second one within a year after Aaron's death. No doubt, in my mind, at least in part, if not greatly related to the grief that he was trying to deal with. Barb spoke about all those effects. She lamented the things missed out on, the things that would never be. She clearly expected justice. But then she offered mercy. See, for Barb, there was no good to be gained from asking for someone who was now in the permanent condition that this man would be in to be imprisoned. Nothing. Nothing good to come from that. And so she asked that the charge be reduced from vehicular homicide to vehicular manslaughter with no time served. The judge agreed. And the judge also agreed to the other thing she demanded. That the driver appear with her at Aaron's high school. My brother's high school. Their daughter's high school. My high school. To speak to the students about the effects and the ramifications and the dangers of drunk and reckless driving. Barb offered mercy that day. And she did it without any of the coldness and calculation and manipulation and cruelty that Joseph sent his brother's way before getting to that place of offering mercy. And she did it from the very same mindset, moral and spiritual and ethical foundation expressed in Joseph's question. am I in the place of God? In other words, vengeance belongs to God, not us. And to her, insisting that that man go to prison in that state wasn't justice. It was vengeance. Barb understood, still understands, that vengeance belongs to God, and rightly so. Rightly so. And I don't mean that in the sense that that phrase is so often understood as meaning that God actually does carry out vengeance. I don't mean it that way. What I mean when I say vengeance belongs to God is that that is meant to be a cautionary. A cautionary to us. The idea that vengeance belongs to God and should belong to God because we are not equipped for it. Because we humans are not capable of handling it or controlling it when it gains a foothold in our lives. And what Barb understood then and still understands today is when that desire for vengeance gains that kind of hold in a person, as well as the anger that so often fuels it, well, it harms everything and everyone in its path. Maybe especially the person who wants that vengeance. Now, I don't say any of that. I do not share that story with you today because I am in any way suggesting that those who cannot respond to that kind of harm in the same way are somehow morally or ethically or spiritually weak or deficient. Not saying that at all. I tell all this, I share this story with you today through the lens of the Joseph story, simply to suggest that if mercy can be shown in an extreme like that, even once in a while, and not by some biblical hero, but by some ordinary woman in northern New York State 20 years ago, then maybe we're more capable, could be more capable of showing mercy in the less extreme times when we have been wronged or harmed. More capable of seeking not vengeance, but that marriage of justice and mercy that my sister-in-law asked for that day. To me, it was, and it still is, heroic. Heroic. Morally, ethically, and spiritually heroic. But the thing is she doesn't see it that way. She didn't then. She doesn't now. We talked about it. We just spent 2 weeks with her and the family in New York on vacation. Still doesn't see it that way. What she saw it as then, and as she still sees it as now, is simply trying to help God bring about as much good out of a horrible situation as possible. Or as Everett Fox would put it, to help God plan over the evil that was done. But I don't know. Isn't that really what being morally and ethically and spiritually heroic is all about? Amen.